Do we have you? Hey,
there he
how
is.
you doing?
How are
What's
you
going
guys?
on?
Good to see
We're
you.
doing great.
Welcome to the show.
Would you mind kicking it off with a little introduction for yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Hey, everyone. Aditya Agarwal here. I'm the managing partner here at South Park Commons.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in the tech industry for about 20 years now. Kind of started off by meeting a very young 19-year-old Mark Zuckerberg in like early 2005 when I just moved out here. Facebook was still working out of the famous house. And so kind of meeting a 19-year-old Zuck at that point was pretty obvious. The dude was special.
Yeah.
How
and
old
then
were
kind
you?
of that.
How old were you at that time?
I was 22.
Wow.
Okay. So you were like,
amazing.
3 years younger than me, but generational founder. I should probably join the company.
That's great.
It's funny. It's like I kind of joke that I love working for founders younger than myself because I went for working for Zuck too. I then did my own company after Facebook, which then got acquired by Dropbox. I was Dropbox's first acquisition. And then I was the CTO there working for a young Drew Houston and a young Arash Verdoshi.
Wait, so did you
yeah.
recruit Guido van Rossum personally?
I did.
That's incredible.
I personally recruited GVR
Let's
to come
go.
join Dropbox.
Creator of Python.
Wow.
Absolute
yeah.
legend.
And it's interesting,
BDFL,
right? Because
the benevolent dictator for life of Python. Probably the most
BDFL.
important programming language in modern history.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because, Python, at that point, Dropbox was probably the most used, I would say, consumer app, maybe actually the most used kind of app in general, written mostly in Python. Because a bunch of our backend and front end was actually kind of like code gen using Python.
Yeah.
And Guido's a legend. I mean, I think that the way he has crafted Python, both by himself, then at Google, then under kind of the Dropbox auspices, was just legendary. And it's kind of amazing. It's kind of becoming the programming language of choice for AI as well, right? Kind of like most of the AI programming is actually done all in Python, which is pretty crazy.
Wild.
Yeah, he's one of the best to ever do it.
Let's talk about the news because it was hitting the timeline. I think it was Friday. New Fund 3. Maybe talk about the genesis of the fund and the series of funds to get where you guys are today.
For sure. Happy to tell you about SVC Fund 3, that's South Park Commons Fund 3. But maybe instead of kind of telling you about the fund sequence, let's talk about why SPC exists, right? SPC was started in 2016 with the simple premise that if you are a talented technologist, do not waste your life kind of tackling small ideas, right? I'd say that there are two big mythologies that we've been trying to bust, if you will. So the first big mythology is that, we all have this mental model of kind of like founders essentially getting a stroke of inspiration, going up to the top of a mountain, and then coming back to us with kind of the promised product, right? It's framed as this like solitary hero kind of, or heroine kind of act. But our strong premise is that great companies basically come out of insanely high talent density, right? They come out of places like PayPal, which kind of show what greatness looks like, and then people go out and build things. They come out of like places like, obviously Facebook. Then we have had a bunch of companies out of Google, Xerox, Spark, obviously. And we also see this greatness kind of occurring in clusters all across us. Like we see it in like elite sports teams. We see it in elite kind of like musicians. We kind of see it in like essentially academia. So our take was that if you want to start a company, why would you want to go and kind of like ideate by yourself, right? Instead, be surrounded by super high talent density, people who challenge you, where interesting collisions of ideas can happen. And it's kind of a semi-competitive collaborative setting, right? You want to be surrounded by the best people who are kind of challenging and pushing on your ideas. But then you also have a little bit of like, you're looking over your shoulder being like, I want to aspire to the greatness that I see around me, right? So that's our first mythology, which is that in order to start a company, you should be surrounded by great people. And the second one, which is maybe it's almost, it's more than a pet peeve for me, which is that there's a generation of founders that argue over the last decade in Silicon Valley who basically, because of the availability, frankly, of early stage seed capital, kind of latch on to the first idea that they think of, right? Because they have some idea, somebody gives them like a seed check, and then they think that the idea is good, right? And our take is that actually, instead of just focusing on the first idea that you have, take some time to wander. Let your mind kind of like go lateral, figure out it's unlikely that the first idea that you have is the best one, right? If you kind of just think about it from a probabilistic perspective. So our take at SPC is that come spend 6, 9, 12 months with us, wandering, ideating, exploring, tinkering, letting interesting ideas come about. And in some ways, everybody is so focused on scaling the mountain. We talk about hyperscaling, we talk about scaling the mountain, that nobody stops to ask, like, is this the right fucking mountain? Like, is this the best mountain that you want to go climb? Everest has 16 peaks over the Everest range has 16 peaks over 8,000 meters. Like, which one are you going to pick, right? Like, that's a pretty good one, right? So
K2 because it's the hardest.
K2 is the hardest
in the winter.
Highest fatality rate by sure.
Yeah. Some founders just want the pain, and so they go K2, North Face during the winter.
Oh yeah.
Wait, really quickly. What the name? Not South Park Capital, not South Park Ventures, South Park Commons. What does that mean?
It was a name that was actually chosen by our early members, right? So our early members in circa 2016, 2017. The idea is that it is a meeting place of ideas, right? Like, it's kind of formed by the Commons, obviously, very famously out of London, but a place where the intellectual public can gather to kind of introduce ideas, kind of essentially debate ideas. Some of the folks that we were inspired by back in the day were Benjamin Franklin's Junto Club, right? We actually remain deeply inspired by that, which is it exists as a society to better each other, to kind of towards greatness. So the idea was that SPC, I mean, sure, we have 20 people on staff here. We have a bunch of investors. I think we're awesome. But ultimately, a lot of the value of SPC is being surrounded by great talent that can all kind of push each other. So when you come back to the genesis of the fund, right, guys, in the early days, there was no fund. We framed ourselves as a learning community. We framed ourselves essentially as an exploration society, kind of the Royal Exploration Society in the 1800s in the UK, with the idea being that being a founder is kind of being like an explorer in the early days, right? You're trying to navigate the idea maze. You should be able to throw away the bad ideas in pursuit of the great ones. And then over time, what we realize is that this is actually an interesting model for early stage kind of company exploration, right? So we would basically provide a place where people would come in, and essentially it was very hard to get in, right? It's, we do maintain super rigorous standards for essentially getting in. We put people through multiple interviews, reference checks. So for instance, this year, 20,000 people plus will apply to be part of SPC across 250 spots across SF, New York, and Bangalore. So it is very rigorous to get in, but once people essentially got in, we would kind of have a very vibrant intellectual environment where we would invite really interesting people at the frontier of their fields. So for instance, I remember back in 2016 and 2017, a young Vitalik would be walking through kind of SPC, just talking to people about some of his ideas around distributed systems. We would have GDB and Ilya walking around telling people about kind of what was happening in deep learning. And I know that today these guys are world famous, but back in 2016, they were still trying to pioneer something that felt a little bit heretical, right? Which is this idea that we were about to enter kind of a Cambrian explosion of machine learning away from the deep learning winter. So we have always welcomed the people who are kind of in some ways pushing the boundary. So it was framed as a learning society. But as people kind of came and spent time in SPC, we realized that they were actually converging on more interesting ideas by way of their exploration. So as they started essentially starting companies, Ruchi is one of the founders of SPC, would basically write angel checks and introduce them to our investor network. But over time, we decided that hey, why don't we start a fund to invest in SPC companies? And the fund would also, for instance, the fees coming in from the fund would be used to essentially provide for staff and also provide for the building that we have in South Park, right? And that fund one was a $55 million fund in 2018. That fund has done phenomenally well. It's kind of going to be in the top 5% of its vintage of that year. On the backs of that, there you go. Boom, 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 boom. Is that the money bell? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, the size gone.
And then on the backs of that, we raised another fund in late 2021, which was a $135 million fund. That fund is actually outpacing fund two is outpacing fund one. And on the backs of that, we have just raised Fund 3, which is the $275 million fund to invest across the globe, but also specifically the USA and India. And the model's scaling well.
I'm curious. So I want to get into potentially some of the learnings, the broader learnings for companies. You talked a little bit about this sort of the unicorn factory. Companies come, they get $2 to $5 million. They announce their fundraise, maybe they launch, and that's sort of like this, then they're on this sort of treadmill, right? And it just speeds up and speeds up, and hopefully you don't get thrown off of it at some point. You can keep the pace up. But one of the things I've been talking about recently on the show is kind of how that timeline can actually end up hurting your business. If you pick an idea, you have a super high profile launch, and then everybody knows you as this company that does this one thing, but maybe in that process you discover a totally different idea, or it makes sense to pivot. And I'm curious, seeing so many of these companies go from 0 to 1, and then I'm sure ultimately oftentimes, pivot into other areas. What is the core advice that you're giving to founders that are joining at the earliest stages, SPC, maybe pre-idea, or maybe they only have ideas of an idea, to help them avoid that? We saw, we had the founder of Cluely on a couple weeks ago, and he's had, 2, maybe 3, 4, 5 super viral moments around what he's doing. And my advice to him was, don't be afraid to basically reinvent yourself, just because, in 3 months, if it's not working as well as it should, right? And I've gone through this in the past myself, which is, going viral before you have product market fit is not always
gift and a curse.
It's a gift and a curse, right?
Double-edged sword.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I mean, I think it's a well-phrased question, and I think insofar as the question also contains some of the answer, right? My take is that, honestly, the cheapest time, the easiest time to kind of do pathfinding and to do pivots is in the earliest days. And in some ways, like, obviously, my point of view is that you shouldn't raise a ton of money, right? Like the first $2, $3, $5 million should be easy to raise, right? Like that should be your easiest raise, right? In the sense of like you're kind of converging on an idea that is making people excited. What you really want in the earliest days is to have a lightness of being in terms of like making sure that you can actually objectively examine the idea from all sides, right? Like if it's not working, put another way, here's something I often tell founders. Your first $2 million of sales should be damn easy, right? Like I think that people often conflate that, like, I'm going to go and do hand-to-hand combat to kind of go and get my first $2 million of sales. It's like, what are you talking about? Like if you have a great idea, that first 2, 5 should be easy, right? People should be taking a product that is half-baked because it's so resonant. So my take is that, like, wait around and kind of like keep on kind of like doing big pivots or small pivots until that idea comes into focus, right?
Yeah.
Entrepreneurship, like any founder that you talk to that has gone on kind of a unicorn or a decagon journey, it is long. It is super painful, right? Like if you are going to sign up for a super long kind of like game, take the time in the beginning to make sure that it's actually like the right mountain, the right game to play. And I think that, I mean, if you kind of think about it, guys, it makes sense that a lot of trends, I think, at least in our industry, make sense to me when viewed from the lens of like, we are trying to push founders to start things as soon as possible, right? Like, software kind of enables that, like, super low cloud computing costs kind of like enable that. But I think the flip side is something what we have seen is that I actually would argue that over the last 10 years, founders have shied away from a problem that doesn't immediately come into focus, right? If you can't code like V1 in like a month, or if it requires like physical atoms, if it requires kind of like talking to anybody that is not over the internet, people tend to shy away from it. Right. And my take is that there are actually tons of super interesting kind of problems to tackle if you widen your aperture in the early days. And again, whether you raise like $1 million or $5 million, I would urge raising less, but ultimately it's kind of about having that mindset of being light in the beginning, because none of your early investors actually care that much if you pivot like 5 times, because the alignment around like the biggest outcome is just there.
Yeah. How did you think about fund construction with the new fund? Just the nature of venture means that, a handful of companies in the fund will end up, being, maybe an order of magnitude larger than the rest. And I imagine you've learned a lot of lessons from the first couple funds around, making sure that you're able to participate in multiple rounds, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'd say that the first thing that we often talk about is that fund size is an output, not an input variable, right? I think there's a lot of managers in our industry that basically raise a big fund and then come up with a strategy to deploy the fund. For us, kind of the methodology always has been like fund size is an output of the number of founders that we can serve, the number of people we can have in our community. We strongly believe in that our community is best facilitated when things feel intimate, right? So this is why, like, none of our spaces in SF, New York, and Bangalore are more than like 150 people. And then we kind of have a sense of like how many of these members can each of our kind of like investors support, such that we can actually provide them with an amazing, frankly, white glove experience. Like I personally work closely with like 30, 40, 50 founders per year. And that's the fun part of the job, right? So a lot of it is just like, what is the maximum number of people we can support both in the community, but also on a per investor basis? And then we kind of back our way into a fund size from that. Frankly, I think that right now we are not constrained. The big thing that we are constrained by is simply our ability to support these founders, not from demand for the product, if you will, right? Like I think that just looking at the numbers in terms of how many people want to be part of SPC, I think we are humbled, I think, by the interest. It also kind of makes sense, guys, in the sense that I think one of the really interesting trends for us is that how many second time founders join us, right? Or how many like essentially people who have been early employees at like a Stripe or a Scale join us. And I think it's because they see I think we're kind of spreading a philosophy, which is that if you want to play this repeated game of startups, right, and you want to start companies, like it's better to be surrounded in the early days by super high talent density. I think one of our goals at SPC has always been that startups are hard, but startups create a lot of value. Let us figure out a way to kind of like actually make them more net productive for everyone. So I think that the -1 philosophy is resonating. We obviously want to serve as many founders as we can ourselves, but I also hope that like other people start up -1 things, and we're starting to see a bunch of, I would say, folks who have similar philosophies. Like -1, I think, has entered the vernacular now, which makes me really proud. So yeah, fund size is an output. I actually think we can serve a lot more people as we figure out ourselves how to scale. But more than that, like -1 is kind of a big thing. It's kind of a big philosophy that makes me proud to be able to share with the world.
Totally. You co-founded Bezel. Sorry, not Bezel. Bevel.
Actually,
Bezel's one of our.
Bezels were part of the motivation for kind of talking about Bevel. But yes, I did co-found Bevel last year.
Yeah. I would love for you to talk about that and how it's been. It makes a lot of sense. I think one of the biggest complaints people have about different fitness trackers is the data is not always consistent, right?
Correct.
Your Whoop might tell you a different, tell you you're walking more than your Aura ring or whatnot. And having a platform that can pull all that data into a single place and help you understand different trends makes a lot of sense. And just the nature of bundling and unbundling. But talk about maybe the genesis there and how it's been going.
For sure. I think probably like a bunch of us 6 years ago, kind of when COVID first, kind of like the lockdowns and stuff started, decided to channel a lot of my pent up energy into kind of just like going full beast mode on my health, like basically analyzing everything like sleep, fitness, nutrition, body metrics, everything. And I started to maintain these super detailed spreadsheets, and these spreadsheets were basically like I have all of this data collected on a daily basis going back 6 years. It's kind of stored in a combination of like Google Sheets and Airtable. And I think everything that you said, like, I would collect data from 3 different sources, right? I would collect data from my Aura ring. I also had an early Fitbit, and obviously when Apple Watch came out, and some of the data would be like a little bit different, and I would basically normalize it. I would also collect a bunch of qualitative data about my own kind of like, I would say, experience. So when I was talking to Ben and Gray, who were at SPC, they were also essentially going through similar journeys. They've kind of been through a little bit of the ringer in terms of their first startup. And as we were talking about what we wanted out of essentially like a health app, a lot of what we were saying is that essentially, number one, all of these health devices at this point were kind of like offering you like a dashboard of your data, but nothing was really tying it together. I mean, Apple Health is fine, right? Like it's not a bad product, but it's a little busy. And it's kind of like very specific to that ecosystem. So our take was that how do we kind of create, as step one, the best place to ingest all of your kind of health data? Because at this stage, it's not just your rings, your watches, it's also your 8 sleep mattress. It's also like, everything basically is kind of like creating this health data, which is awesome, right? It's beautiful because I think it's indicating that consumers care about this. So our take was step one, how do we get all of this into a one place that essentially, is that a 8 sleep? There we go. Amazing. Yeah, that's a great product, right? Like 8 sleep. But 8 sleep gives you a nightly sleep score, as does your Aura ring, maybe if you wear your watch. So like, how do we make sense of all of this data into a clean, consistent place? Right. And it was a simple proposition. It was one of those classic things. Let's just build what we want. And Ben and Gray are just world-class kind of builders and designers. So they just built something that was beautiful. It was easy to use. And we put it out there. And it's just been all kind of like crazy organic demand. We're not divulging too many numbers, but we are definitely kind of the number of users and kind of paid subs. It's just kind of blown us away. We've kind of been on a tear for the last like 6 months.
Well, there's this idea that once you get to a certain obsession level in health, the amount of money that you'll spend on an incremental 1%, gain in your health is like, you get to a point where I did this like NAD treatment last year. That in hindsight was like, I think a terrible use of funds, but it was like it was like a series of I think it was like $6,000 over like multiple treatments, and I was like, I didn't feel anything at the end, but at the time I was like, if this is gonna make me like, if I'm gonna feel like 5% more energized during the day, it's totally worth it. But
it's a great market.
That's cool. I'm curious. Last thing, because I know we have a cutoff here, and there's probably a founder you need to chat with. What are you seeing today at a high level? You guys have a unique insight into the sort of trends and categories that will be probably hot in a year, and you're probably making those investments now. I'm sure a lot of the obvious stuff, agents, MPC, that kind of thing. But what's getting a lot of your attention today?
Probably two areas that I would highlight, and maybe this is, I think both of these are somewhat well understood now. The first one is the amount of, I would say, enthusiasm and excitement for stuff around robotics is very real. This is both kind of like building actual robotics like hardware to kind of building robotics kind of, I would say, middleware, kind of like think like, end-to-end stacks for coding on robots, then obviously robotics foundation models. It's hard to say whether it will all translate into usable products over the next 3 or 4 years, but over a 10-year horizon, I think that the energy is just substantial, much more so than I've ever seen in my career. And the second one I'd point out is that, a lot of the times the conversation around foundation models has really centered around essentially like take what we have and kind of like throw more compute at it, throw more data at it. But it's surprising to me that a lot of people don't actually take a step back and realize there are lots of smart researchers out there who are building the next generation of algorithmic changes to these models. So there are lots of really interesting, both, I would say, variants, but also novel takes on, for instance, what would a pure RL-based kind of like model look like, right? If you had to ingest reinforcement learning from day one. So I'm seeing a lot of energy around building the next generation of foundation models. It's a little bit, I would say, still hazy, but it's very exciting because I still think we're at the tip of essentially the innovation we're going to see on top of these core LLM capabilities.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean,
I can't assume we're at the end of history and all the future algorithmic progress.
It's so crazy, right? Like everybody assumes that like it's just going to pause and then we're going to scale it up. And I'm just like, no. There's a ton of like energy around core innovation around the algorithms.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Good
all right. Well, I know we've already had some of your founders on, but let's make sure to get more on. And thank you for coming on and telling the story, and congrats on the new fund.
Amazing. Thank
you
so
guys.
Much.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Congrats.
Have a good one.